Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This is Danny Chisholm, and thanks for being part of another episode of Elisha's Bears. And I'm very excited about our special guest today, Dr. Pam Durso. Pam, it's good to have you with us. How are you doing?
I am doing very well. Thank you, Danny. Thanks for inviting me.
Listen, I want to talk about you, and then I want to talk to you. Is that all right?
Okay.
Okay, what I mean by talk about you, I'm going to try to hit a little bit of the things about your bio. You became the 11th president of Central Baptist Theological Seminary in June of 2020.
Yes.
You have two degrees from Baylor University, a BA degree in religion, 1983, and a PhD degree in church history in 1992.
Yes.
And also in between those times, you managed to get a Master of Divinity degree from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. You were Associate Executive Director of Baptist History and Heritage Society. You've been a professor of church history, and immediately prior to the work you're doing now, you were the Executive Director of Baptist Women in Ministry. And from what I've read, it said during that time period, you grew the annual budget by 300% in 10 years. I see you nodding. Is that about right?
That's about right. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm guessing fundraising is still part of your work now?
It is very much a part of my work now. It's a good percentage of my time spent with fundraising and
Yeah, I
donors.
would think so. And you were the editor and author of several books, and forgive me if I don't get all of these, but one of them is The Story of Baptist in the United States, On Mission with God, Free and Faithful Baptist in the 21st Century, What a Preacher Looks Like, Sermons by Baptist Women in Ministry.
Hmm.
And you are an ordained Baptist minister, and you served the local church as an interim pastor, and you've held other leadership positions. That sounds like a full life so far.
So far, been pretty busy.
Do you remember you were in my office? You were in the Knoxville area, and our mutual friend Vicki Violet came to me and said, Danny, Pam is in the area. Can she come preach? And I did not hesitate at all. I was thrilled to get you because I had just gotten here. That was February 16th, 2020. I was going to ask you, do you remember that? And then secondly, did you know you were going to be president at Central when you were in my office?
I do remember it because one of my former McAfee students was there at your church, and I remember seeing him and his small children. So that's a good memory for me. Did I know? I'm trying to think of what date they actually invited me to be president. I may have known, yes.
Okay, because I would have been disappointed. That would have been a fun thing to get a scoop on.
Well,
But
I'm very good at keeping confidential information
yeah,
confidential.
I know. But right after that, and I've been here about 6 years, and I'd been here a couple of months. And then if you were here in February, it seemed like the month later, that's when things blew up
Hmm.
with COVID. And I was curious about your presidency, more or less began during the early days of COVID. It's not much of a honeymoon period, I would guess, but I'm going to ask, what do you remember about those days?
Well, I look back at, I was named publicly as president, I think it was March 8th, 2020. And about 10 days later, the World Health Organization declared COVID a global pandemic. So I often joke that those two things were not related, that I became a president of a seminary was in no way connected to the beginning of a global
Okay.
crisis. So,
Well, we
but
can get that out of the way first.
it, in taking the job, I had to move from Atlanta to Kansas. And so my husband and had plans to fly to Kansas. And because of COVID, the airports, were not a safe place. Hartsfield Jackson International was not a really safe place in those early days of the pandemic. So we drove across the country so we could buy a house. And, it was the time where touching things was still a little suspicious, wearing gloves. And it was pretty traumatic in the sense of just taking on this whole new world in the midst of all of the unknowns of COVID. But we managed to find a house. We sold our house. We moved in May. So I moved across the country in that would have been like 2 months into the pandemic and settled into our house, and I started on June 1st. The faculty had a car welcome for me. They came in their cars and stood by their cars and all waved signs. So it was back in those early days where, even being in person was a little dangerous, and we thought that was true. So we did everything in the parking lot, which was fun, but very different than what I expected my first few days to be like. Our building was primarily empty
Yeah,
for
yeah.
those first few weeks with only the highest administration people in the building. So it was kind of a lonely way to start a new job, but we managed to make it work. And because Central had been doing things on Zoom for 3 or 4 years by then, doing classes and other meetings, it was just a natural way for us to gather. So we had community meetings and faculty senate meetings, all of those were on Zoom. So in some ways, it was an easier transition for Central as a seminary than it was for many people in many churches.
Did you ever envision being a seminary president? Was that ever on your radar, on your bucket list of things?
No, it was not my intention. I loved my job with Baptist Women in Ministry, mentoring women and sitting with them and hearing their stories, helping them to connect to places of service. It just gave me so much joy that my intention was to retire as executive director of Baptist Women in Ministry. So I was not looking for a new role or even thinking that would be something that I would be open to. So I got a call from the consultant who was working the search, and when he called me the first time and told me that I was a potential candidate for this role, I laughed, and we had a nice laugh, and I hung up and went my merry way, and he called me back a couple times, and I then started to pay attention. You know, with the women and men that I'd worked with as students and with Baptist Women in Ministry, I'd always told them to pay attention. When the Spirit shows up, you need to start paying attention and look for those signs of the Spirit's movement. So I took that seriously, that this was my time to pay attention, and I gathered around me a discernment group who would help me think about, name my gifts, helped me to see if this was really a possibility for my capacity and my abilities, and then to pray with me and to seek God's leadership in this. And in the end, I submitted my application the day before it was due, and the rest kind of worked out and unfolded, and this became a calling for me, not just a new job. I felt called to do this because of that process.
So the day before the deadline, you said that's when you said, okay, I'm at peace with this and I'm going to move forward with it?
Yes, I waited to the last minute. I'm usually not that person. I always do things early, so that was kind of a moment for me to be beating the deadline by a day.
I'm going to come back to Central later on. I want to ask, why are you a Baptist? And that might be self-evident. Why are you a Baptist, and why or how have you stayed a Baptist?
I guess it's self-evident why I'm a Baptist. I was born into a family that had generations of Baptists. My great-grandparents, my grandparents, and then my father was a pastor, a Baptist pastor. And so it wasn't an optional thing in my life. Being Baptist was just part of who I was. It was how I identified my family DNA. And so I was very active in our church growing up. As a pastor's daughter, we were there all the time. And service and ministry in the church was part of something we did as a family. I've cleaned more churches than I like to even know about, but that was part of what we did. We worked in the nursery when we were teenagers. We helped with children. Being a Baptist and serving were the two things from my childhood that were very important. And when I went off to Baylor, the first time as a freshman, I was still a very strong Baptist, attended a Baptist church. But as I went to seminary, Southern Baptist in 1983 passed a resolution about women's ordination. That for me was a signal that I wasn't necessarily always going to be welcome into my Southern Baptist circles. And yet I stayed Southern Baptist for a few years and stayed Baptist even to this day. As the controversy heated up with the Southern Baptist, I feel like I didn't leave them so much as they moved away from who I was and who I was
Right.
to be.
Right.
And so I had to find a new family, a new Baptist family, and for me that was the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And when that was founded in 1990, 1991, it felt like a place for me to come home to, a place where my calling, my gifts, my vocational hopes and dreams would be able to play out and be welcomed and not just tolerated. And so we quickly became my husband and I quickly joined in with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship movement in the early 90s.
Well, along those lines, and you may have referred to this, but what were some of the obstacles or opposition you may have run into in the mood of being on a Southern Baptist campus and then preparing for ministry and at that time Southern Baptist life? And also conversely, can you identify maybe some encouragers who kind of helped you stay the course?
Sure. Well, For me, my time at Southwestern, I had already done a religion degree at Baylor, and so I've had a really strong foundation. Going to Southwestern, in some ways, was my own anxiety around kind of pushing the boundaries and getting outside the state of Texas and going someplace else. And so I kind of settled. Fort Worth was not too far away from Waco. It was a known territory for me. And so I decided to go there, even in the midst of knowing that Southern Baptist might be moving away from me. But it was not a hostile place to me at Southwestern in the sense of I never felt any kind of ridicule or criticism out loud. I experienced it more as curiosity. There were many men, and I was in their classes, who wondered why I was there and what I was hoping to do. And especially in the preaching class, I did get the questions of, are you really going to preach? And my response was always, it's on the syllabus, it's a required assignment. I am a rule follower. If it's assigned, I will do it. Yes, I will preach.
I remember in New Orleans, there was a professor there. I think he was the dean at the time, Pam, but when women showed up for the pastoral work class, he would not allow them to sit in. He would give them permission to take a counseling course or anything like, but you never ran into that. You could more or less take whatever classes you wanted.
I did the standard MDiv courses and took all the classes that I wanted to and did really well. I was a very good student in seminary, and so part of it was just this is what I felt I was supposed to be doing, and maybe I just didn't hear the comments that were being made around me, or maybe I just didn't pay attention. But I felt very strongly that this calling to study was part of my life's journey. And I had a group of friends in seminary that we often skipped chapel and went to the coffee shop instead.
Nice.
We were rebels in that sense. But the question about influencers and encouragers, my biggest encourager really in both my academic journey and my vocational journey was a professor I had in college, Dr. Bill Pitts, who continued to be my professor when I went back and did a PhD. He was the church historian at Baylor in the religion department, so I studied church history with him as a PhD student. But even as an undergraduate, he was the one who inspired me to think about teaching really as a vocation, to think about my giftedness, and he was always an encourager to me. He continues to be that in my life. I see him 2 or 3 times a year. He has been a constant source of care for me and encouragement, and has helped me to identify my giftedness, but has always been there, for me to ask questions. He and his wife both, Ruth and Bill Pitts, have been my greatest encouragers, I think, along the way.
We crossed paths in St. Louis at the CBF assembly, and I was grateful Callie, my daughter, and I got to be there. Summertime is the time for Baptists to do things, and they meet, and we were grateful to be in St. Louis, and I was grateful they worked in a Cardinals game during the assembly, but I'll pivot off of that. The Southern Baptists also met, of course, and this is the 25th anniversary of the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message. What, if any, reactions have you had to the Baptist Faith and Message, maybe looking back on it then and where you are now?
So, Danny, I don't pay much attention to the Southern Baptist Convention. I don't read all the articles that are written about them or by them. I just really, in the last 25 years, I haven't paid much attention. I felt like, it was just time for me to dust off my feet and walk away. And so I am not one of those who stays connected or pays great attention. So I didn't even know it was the 25th anniversary.
I'm glad I can remind you of that, so you could.
Yeah. And when it was passed, even in 2000, by then I was teaching at Campbell Divinity School in North Carolina, and I was living out my calling. And the acceptance of the statements in the Baptist Faith and Message about the role of women and the place of women, I was living in really opposition to some of that, and it really didn't have an impact on me then either, because my being faithful to my calling and seeking to serve God and to be the person God had called me to be was much more important than what Southern Baptist. I think I really did in some ways a sharp leave when I finally moved into the CBF. There was a lot of grieving in that, but it didn't last as long as some people's has. So I just don't really pay attention to Southern Baptist much anymore. They don't have influence in my life. And I have friends who are Southern Baptists and family members who I love, but the convention itself is not something that I think much about.
That's fair enough. But On a similar note, and of course we mentioned this, you were the executive director of Baptist Women in Ministry,
Yes.
and I hope you don't mind if I quote you to you, okay?
Okay.
This was back in 2015, one of the State of Women in Baptist Life reports. I think it says it was revised in 2016. The quote is, "The reality of Baptist life, however, is that giftedness and readiness for the pastorate does not always result in a woman being called by a Baptist church. Some women endure great heartache because of an extended search process and the relentless rejection they encounter via letters and emails." And I believe you documented the stories of 3 women in that process. Could you talk about the importance and the place of story as it relates to calling, and why it's so important to record and talk about these stories?
Sure. So, in my journey to discover what God was calling me to do, I chose to major in religion at Baylor my freshman year. That became evident that that's what I wanted to do. And then I took my first church history class with Dr. Pitts when I was a junior and realized that church history was the place I wanted to give my life to study the history of the church. And I think I was drawn to that because I am a storyteller. I think in story, I live in story, I preach, I'm a narrative preacher. And so collecting stories for me is a way to preserve history, but also to engage with people. Because I think, Jesus was a storyteller, and we can connect with people by story. And so preserving stories, both the good ones and the hard ones, the inspiring ones and the discouraging ones, is a reflection of who we are and a reflection of life that we have shared. And so preserving the stories of women, and many women have been hurt by their Baptist churches and by their Baptist denominations, but many of them have found places to serve and have kind of just kept going until they find a spot. I think that was true for so many of these women that I shared stories about, that even though they were rejected and even though they got, the we're not ready for a woman pastor yet, our church isn't ready to go there, so many of them persisted and continued to seek and put themselves out there, which I think is a story of great courage, to continue to try to live out your calling even when people are saying no. And I'm not saying that I didn't get plenty of no's. I got lots of no's in trying to find a teaching position. When I graduated with my PhD in 1992, the Southern Baptist seminaries and colleges would not talk to me because I was a woman, and they were not going to hire a woman for faculty. And the Presbyterians and the Methodists didn't want a Baptist, so that was my problem with many of them. And then the schools, the public schools, they were skeptical of all the things of a Baptist woman teaching in a public university. And so I got lots of rejection letters trying to find a teaching position. I got some rejection letters around trying to look for a church to pastor. So there were plenty of no's in that. And I think for my story, continuing to say yes to God in the midst of hearing no so often is the balance that I have tried to live, is to be a person of yes and saying yes despite the no's I hear.
Yeah. Well, of course, we serve in a Baptist context, and in your role as a seminary president, when you have someone come and talk to you about their call to ministry, let's say specifically a female student comes and talks to you about their call, and whether or not to remain in the Baptist denomination or go to another denomination, first of all, does that happen? And if so, what does that conversation look like?
That conversation has happened numerous times with me over the course of teaching in seminaries and then in my current position. And all of the conversations are different. Some of the women have a deep conviction that they need to leave. What I have discovered just looking around in our Cooperative Baptist Fellowship family, if you look at the generations of women at CBF, if you look at the generations of women who are in my age range, there are not women between the age of 55 and 65. You don't find many of them at CBF because so many of them left. They left Southern Baptist, they did not move into transition into CBF, or they left CBF in the early days because they wanted to serve and live out their calling. And so for me, those conversations with women the door would not open for them and their no's were out, there was never a yes. Leaving Baptist life, I think, was the honest and courageous thing to do, to find a place to serve God. With some women who have said to me, I can't leave because I am Baptist to the very core of me. I cannot leave. I celebrate that too. I think it's every woman, every person has to make that decision of where they can best follow and serve and be themselves. And I tried never to be the one to lead that decision, but rather to be the listener and encourager in those kinds of conversations. I celebrate the women who stayed, and I celebrate the women who left. I
Yeah.
do think we are a poor denomination because we lost so many gifted and thoughtful women who are now Methodist and Presbyterian and UCC and Disciples of Christ, and we are lesser for that.
Well, trying to kind of address that, how can churches, and specifically Baptist churches, how can they or we nurture and encourage women to follow their calling to serve the Lord? And I guess also with the students, and I'm focusing on the women, or do you find students in general are still open to serving in the local church?
For our student population, there are a good number who are serving. The interesting thing about Central is we serve second and third career students, so they've already had at least one career. Many of them are already serving in churches when they come to seminary. But for the women, usually they have found their space already before they come to Central of service. And some of them are in local congregations. We do have some that are counselors and chaplains, running nonprofits, serving as teachers. But there are a good number of our students, our women students, who have found a place to serve in congregational life and are doing that very well. But your first question about how can we as churches encourage
Yeah, yeah.
like girls and teenage girls and even college and young I think we have to make space for them to lead, to read scripture and worship, to lead prayers, make a space for them behind the pulpit so that they know that that's a possibility. And make sure that they see women preaching and serving and praying and leading in the Lord's Supper so that they'll know that every woman is welcome to serve in your church and that women are embraced and included, and it's a place of belonging for women of all ages and all callings, not just those who are called to pastor, but all women who are called to serve.
Yeah. You grew up, or you attended Baptist University, obviously at Baylor, and then you went to Southwestern, and I went to New Orleans. And could you speak a little bit to the differences, and I know there's a lot, some of the differences in student life and education now as compared to maybe when you and I were in school?
So I can only speak from my Central experience.
Okay.
Central is not anything like the seminary I graduated from. 75 to 80% of our students are of Asian heritage. We have a very large Korean language program. We have many students who come to us from the country of Myanmar, which was formerly known as Burma. Our student population is very diverse, so we are multicultural, multilingual, and the majority of our learning happens virtually, so our students gather in classrooms on Zoom. Our classes are in the evenings. Our English language classes primarily are in the evenings because our students are working adults and they work during the day and come to class in the evenings. So it's a very different experience. And one of my great concerns, and really my skepticism about education being done virtually, is how do you build community? How can you do that on Zoom? And I was not sure that could be done and done well, but I have become a convert. Community happens at Central Seminary and it happens on Zoom. We have small classes. Everybody is on the Zoom room. You can see their faces and you can't hide on Zoom. You know, you're right
They don't
there.
let you have a blank screen, Pam, and you put a cat up there, maybe a still
No,
image?
no, they have to show their faces. And, you know, they do bring some cats with them. I have seen cats in classrooms and children coming to say goodnight. So some of those places, you just bring your full life into Zoom with you. And that has really built community of sharing life and having time together where nobody can sit on the back row, everyone's on the front row in Zoom. And I like that about it. I also like that our students connect to each other in ways that while I was a student at Southwestern, I did not live on campus, and so I would drive in for my classes and then, you know, go to work and go back to wherever I was living. So I wasn't a residential student and was somewhat connected to friends I had on campus, but they weren't part of my like everyday weekend life. But with our students, because of texting and because of all of the different technologies, They establish text groups, some of them use WhatsApp. They do all these different ways and stay connected. And I have some really amazing stories about students. We have a student in Florida. She graduated last May. She's a young white woman pastoring a church in Florida, and her closest friend in seminary was a black man living in New York City doing ministry there. And they called each other like brother and sister from another mother.
Got
But
it.
they were in constant touch with each other and texting one another and supporting each other and praying for each other. And then came commencement in May, and they had never been together face to face in person. And so the celebration that happens in those kinds of experiences, where you see this strong, strong commitment and community that's happened, and then you get to be there to watch as that first meeting in person. It's just a beautiful thing. So I'm a believer that community happens. We have chapel on Zoom once a month at Central. We have community meetings for our employees and staff and faculty that gets us connected to each other, and we share in ways that didn't happen prior to using Zoom, which I think is a beautiful thing. So community can happen.
Well, let's stay on Central. Obviously, it opened in October of 1902 with 4 faculty and 6 students, and not to take us through the entire 120-year history necessarily, Pam, but tell us a little bit about where you all are located and maybe some of the changes you've experienced and where you're going.
Sure. So the founding documents of Central, our founding date's 1901, which means that next year we will celebrate our 105th anniversary. So we are a school that has been around for a very long time. It was founded by Kansas Baptist and has had a historic partnership and relationship with the American Baptist churches. So we're an American Baptist seminary. And yet, within 2 years, Central was welcoming students from various denominations. So from the earliest times, we were ecumenical, welcoming Methodist and Presbyterian and others in the area. So that's one of the things I think that has laid the groundwork for all the work we've done over the last 125 years, is that we have welcomed people across theological difference and perspective and affiliation. We also welcomed people from across the world very early on. 11 different countries were represented at Central by 1920. And we graduated our first student from Burma 1918. His name was Basan. He came from Burma and returned to Burma and took this love of education and this love of Central back with him. And so that connection with the country that is now called Myanmar has been ongoing for nearly 120 years. So that diversity, both theological diversity and ethnic, racial, language diversity is just part of who Central has always been. And in recent years, we have learned to celebrate that and to embrace who we are as a multicultural, multilingual seminary. And I think that's what sets us apart from many. We have a good number of immigrant students that we welcome. We offer classes in Korean, English, and Kachin, and we're looking at expanding into Chin, so a couple of the different languages of Myanmar. That is the direction that we have been, and that is the direction that we are going to fully embrace that, continually looking for places where students might not be able to go to seminary because they can't afford it, or it's not accessible because of language, or it's not accessible because of location. So we use Zoom as a way to welcome all students and take education to them. They don't have to move to the Kansas City area. But you ask where we're located. We have recently moved in January. We moved into a building in Overland Park, Kansas. Central has had actually 4 locations over the course of 125 years. Started out by the river in Kansas City, Kansas, and then moved to a different location on Minnesota Avenue in Kansas City. And then in 2005 moved the building to Shawnee. The old building that they'd been in for a long time was starting to fall apart and fall down, and so they bought a building in Shawnee, Kansas, where Central has been. They were there from 2005 until December of 2024. And then because that building was so large, we had 45,000 square feet, and most of our students were not coming to the building. Only 8% of our students live in the Kansas City area. So we sold that building. The board voted to put it on the market, and we sold it to a church. We bought it from a church. We sold it to a church. So that corner on Monticello and Shawnee is still a faith-based corner. of worship and praise. So I feel good about that. But we're now in about a 9,000 square foot building, which gives us classroom space and office space, and it feels we're closer to one another. There's proximity. What I say, in this building, no one can hide because it's small enough that you come in the front door and everybody notices.
Yeah.
I like that about this, and it's been a really good space for us. And I am proud of the building, but most of our students will not ever come into this building, and so we don't need a huge building. And we chose, as with the board and as a leadership team, to put our money into students rather than putting our money into a building with its maintenance, and it needed a new HVAC and all of the things that buildings require. But we now are putting our money to resourcing students.
Yeah, good deal. I want to take you into the lightning round. I've got a few more minutes with you, and these are some random questions, and I want to get this one in. I meant to ask it earlier because Brian Kaler may be listening in, and I want to make sure I get this in. But where do you see the separation of church and state right now? Is the wall of separation hanging in there?
Well, I'm praying that it will hold up. It's under fire from those who are Christian nationalists. I think it's a dangerous time for our historic freedom of separation of church and state. And I appreciate the work that Brian has been doing and many others have been doing to call attention to that, because it's an important piece of who we are as Baptists. Historically, we have always been a respecter that the church operates separately from the state, and that we do not under the influence of the state, and we do not have control over the state. And so that uneasy place that church and state should live is where Baptists have always put faith in the freedom of religion and freedom of speech. But I think it's in great danger in our country in 2025.
Pam, when you look back on where you've been and where you are today, how has your faith in Christ deepened or changed through the years?
The ways that, especially this role, I'm not sure that a person could be a president of a seminary without having both a strong prayer life and a strong support system. And I think God brings the people into our lives that we need at the time when we are struggle or where there's hardness. And theological education is in a time of decline in our country. ATS schools are closing, and so having people who can support you and understand that and walk with you in that journey has been really important to me. And as they have continually pointed me to God, that has been I've had companions, spiritual companions on this journey. One of the stressful things about being a president is that it has affected my sleep. So pretty early in, I stopped sleeping very well. And I learned that if I was going to be awake, I might as well spend some time in prayer if I'm going to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I think in some ways my prayer life has been stronger in these last 5 years because there's been that need to settle my own spirit and to feel that God is with me in the process, just to open myself up to God's presence. And so I think that has increased. I am one of those people who believes that, if it needs to be done, I can do it. And so I'm very independent, and sometimes, that is bumps against faith if I take charge and not wait on God. And so I have learned over the course of my life that sometimes that can-do-it spirit is not where God wants us to be. Sometimes we have to wait and be patient and wait for God's leadership. So I think that's a growing edge for me, and it continues to be a growing edge. But I do think seminary for our students is a place where they are introduced and often encouraged to seek God rather than just seek knowledge. And that has resonated with me, and I have learned so much from our students about having a life of prayer and of faith along this journey. And our students, especially our students from Myanmar, are probably the most have the richest spiritual life of people that I've ever known in my life, and they have inspired me both what God can do and how God lives and is so alive for them. I think that's learning from others is a big part of my spiritual experience.
I was curious, you may have spoken to this. What's the best piece of advice that you may have been given, or a piece of advice that you reflect upon and kind of has helped you along the way?
Well, I have a friend who has told me, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it, which is, when I see a need, I want to fix it. When I see something broken, I want to make sure it is healed. And so just because I can do many things doesn't mean that's what I should be doing. And I think that's helped me both with my time and my energy, but it's also helped me think about that in a spiritual sense of, I have to be attentive to what God is calling me to do rather than just fixing the things I see that need to be fixed. So just because I can do it doesn't mean I should do it.
Got it. Well, if we want to know more about Central or what's going on with you, where do we go to find that?
Sure. We have a wonderful web page, cbts.edu, that's got all about our programs. It has some about our history. We have been doing some cultural competency videos, and they are all on our website. So we've released three of those that are around cultural competency in congregations, and we're about to release 3 more around cultural competency in the classroom. So that's all on our website. We also have a social media outlets, Facebook and Instagram, so you can follow Central there and see what is happening. And I'm out in the social media world as well.
Okay. I want to save maybe the most important one for last. You're a 2-time Baylor grad. Are you a Baylor football fan or a sports fan? Okay. Well,
My husband is the graduate of the University of Oklahoma, so I root with him for the Sooners.
okay. So you kind of gotten into the Southeastern Conference here not too long ago, right?
Yeah, mostly what I watch sports with my husband and my son. Whoever they root for, I root for. So I
Okay.
don't really have a deep affection for any team. But I
Well, that's
root for the
fine.
University of Georgia because my son roots for them, and I root for Oklahoma because my husband roots for them.
No, it's just kind of funny because I noticed that Baylor's going to play Auburn. We're kind of big Auburn fans, and I want to make sure I got that
The
question
sports.
in under the wire.
And so I can't say out loud, I don't even root for the Kansas City Chiefs, but
See, I'm going to have to delete that because
I
that's
know.
just not right.
Well,
Any final thoughts, Dr. Durso, while we're together?
I just appreciate getting to talk to you, Danny, and spend some time with you. And I always love talking about Central, so anytime you want to talk about our students, I am happy to do that.
Well, you've been listening to Dr. Pam Durso, and Pam, I want to thank you for your time and your leadership, and also for being part of this conversation. And until next time, thanks for listening.